Chaps, I'm going to say straight away, we're probably, well, it's not probably, we're going to be bouncing and talking about sexual abuse and abuse. We've called in Fiona from Survivors in Transition, isn't it?
Yep.
Just tell us about yourself, and you are a charity, aren't you? I should know this.
We are. We're a registered charity. We started out as just a peer support group 13 years ago now, and we now take about 1,000 referrals annually of male and female survivors of sexual abuse and sexual violence. So we're based in Suffolk predominantly. We do get referrals from kind of other locations and work with lots of organisations regionally and nationally just to ensure survivors can get support as quickly as possible, really.
How many of those are men?
At the moment, I know that when you and I met, one of the things I talked to you about, we're really concerned that our numbers of male survivors, particularly those making self-referrals, are still down since COVID. So pre-COVID, about 40% of our referrals in a year were from men.
Yeah.
During COVID, that dropped right down to 15%. And since COVID, we're probably kind of hovering around the 20 to 25%. So we've still got about a 15% deficit, to my mind, in terms of men coming through and making men used to predominantly self-refer into the service and not come through a kind of professional referral route. So there's a bit of change. I think there's a lot of change for a lot of people since COVID in terms of what they're dealing with and how they're dealing with things. But we're obviously quite gravely concerned that men are not getting support around their the abuse that they've experienced, and want to ensure that they have a real clear and clean pathway into us and can get that support in a timely fashion.
Yeah, because that does terrify me. Saying like often, I think I said this before in a coffee or whatever. Is that out of the many videos that I've done, I feel like I'm just reading in the script now, so I apologise. And you just feel like you're saying the same thing constantly. Yeah. I would say it must be over half of the videos I've done where they've said actually off air, they've spoken about abuse and stuff like that, but we just cannot get. I think we've done one video which was literally bouncing around sexual abuse. You just can't get bloke. I'm not suggesting that blokes start opening vlogs and all this kind of stuff, but they just it's such we say mental health is a stigma with men, but sexual abuse, it's like there's like as a law it cannot be spoken about, and I find that really terrifying.
I think it is terrifying, and I share your fears, and I think I'm really worried that I feel we've made significant progress before COVID in Suffolk in terms of raising awareness and allowing men the freedom to come forward and get that support. And I'm just really worried that, and it's not only us, there's other organisations I've spoken to, and they've also seen, so nationally, we've also seen a decrease in male referrals into sexual violence specific organisations. We can't quite fathom out why that is. It doesn't surprise me, the figures that you're talking about in terms of when we're talking to men who've got unresolved trauma or mental health issues, there's a high prevalence within that cohort and that demographic who will have experienced sexual abuse or sexual violence of some sort. And I suppose, as a charity that started out supporting women, it was never our intention to support men, but the need became apparent really quickly. And we had men contacting us to say there was no support locally or even regionally for survivors of child sexual abuse. So we quickly shifted things. I think a bit naively, if I'm honest with you, we just thought that we would work with men in the same way we worked with women. But we've worked out over the years that men firstly and initially engage with us in a very different way, and we've had to amend our service to ensure that we've got as many routes or doors or pathways into the service as possible so that men can easily access the service. Secondly, I think one of the kind of nuanced differences for male survivors coming forward that I've recognized over the years is I think there is more guilt, more shame, just more for them to get their heads around before we can actually start tackling the abuse. So there's quite a lot more stabilization and kind of safety and that sort of psychoeducation work that we've got to do up front with men to enable them and to create a safe space for them to start talking about their abuse, because I think it's just radically difficult for men to talk about this, particularly in an open forum such as this. I think the levels of guilt and shame that men experience, who particularly have experienced child sexual abuse, are significantly higher than what we recognize for a number of reasons. And I think what we've got to do and what we've got to say is just meet them where they're at and say, you know, we recognize that, we see that that's a normal response to trauma. That's part of that normal response, and we've got to address it and ensure that we're breaking down those barriers to accessing services a lot better than we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the comments, what did haunt me on a conversation, I'm trying to process that because obviously I don't want to out them and make a mistake on that. But one of the most chilling things they said they shouldn't have let it happen. And I think it goes back to that.
So I think there's something just fundamentally around male genitalia and biology that just suggests to men, particularly when they're adults and they're trying to, I think, come to terms with something that happened when they were a child. It's very difficult when you're an adult to remember that you weren't an adult when this happened to you. And I think
that there is just, I've never heard anyone
huge.
say that before. Yeah,
it's huge because we're sitting in a room with an adult person, whether that's a woman or a man or anyone of any gender, and we're saying we're trying to process something that happened to you as a child. So the first thing we're going to do is say, how big were you? And immediately we're saying, okay, so you're not as big. You're thinking about it now as a 6 foot or whatever size person you are now as an adult. And you're trying to remember something that happened to you probably when you were 3 or 4 foot tall, you were 9, 10, however old, but you were little and you're never to blame for that. The other thing I think we don't talk about enough, and I think I was just having a look at our data this morning, 25% of male survivors we work with have been abused by a woman in childhood. And we don't talk about female perpetrators enough and often, and we don't make it okay to talk about that. And I think, going back to the biology and the genitalia that we were talking about, I think it's very difficult for men to wrap their heads around the fact that they could have done something differently, or they're to blame for what happened, or they could have stopped it in some way. And we hear that repeatedly from male survivors in terms of exactly what you've just said, in terms of feeling responsible, feeling like they should have done something with it. But, predominantly we'll go back to that fact of, you're an adult now, but you weren't an adult when that happened to you. So, we have to try and process it as if you were a child and recognize that it wasn't your fault.
Do you know what
it's quite staggering, isn't it? Like 25%. That's a pretty damning figure, and certainly from what I've kind of seen on social media, it almost feels like it's glorified. Like when you see reports in the press of a female teacher who's abused a child at school, a male child in their teens, it's almost like, well done, son, pat on the back. My teachers were never like that, and it's horrendous. It's horrendous to see that, because that's still a kid that's been abused, and
yeah,
that's a phenomenally high number. And my partner used to work in children's services, and over lockdown it became a little bit too much for her, and she left, and she's just something else now. But she said the level of referrals that they received over lockdown were just frighteningly, they just shot up quickly. So do you think there's going to be a much bigger spike, and there's a much bigger issue coming further down the line by the time this all filters through the system and these kids are going to be a little bit older?
Ian, I do. And I think, we talked as professionals in different roles and across different sectors. We talked the whole way through COVID about the tsunami of need that was going to come when we came out of COVID. That was the terminology. I think we're only just starting to see kind of that wave land on the beach now in terms of referrals coming through. I mean, we're just having our, so our normal kind of referral patterns and numbers and things this year are all over the place. They're not following any trajectory from any of our previous 10 years of service. They're kind of up and down. We're seeing spikes. We've just had the busiest summer we've ever had in 13 years. We normally see a drop off of referrals over the summer while, I don't know, people have got, kids at home and stuff like that. It's just been insane. It hasn't dropped off at all. So I think we're starting to see that. But the point that you make, for me, is also telling, because loads of the myths around sexual abuse and sexual violence, we all like to think that there's a a grungy old man in the park with a coat and he's flashing young children and stuff like that. It's very hard for us to conceptualize and indeed to process that most abuse happens but at the hands of someone who's very well known to a child, often in the family. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to acknowledge that. But the fact that social care, and certainly the MASH, we're seeing their highest number of sexual abuse cases come through during COVID, suggests to me that, that's because people were at home more, and that was happening more and more. And I think what we've got to do, we have to enable particularly young men to be able to start talking about their abuse when they're much, much younger. We don't want, I never believe it's too late for someone to get support around the abuse that they've experienced. But what we want to avoid is 60 and 70-year-olds coming through our doors, having not processed or had their abuse affect them their entire adult life. So affect every relationship, affect their sexuality in many cases, cause them to question who they are as a man and how they perform as a man and how they're viewed as a man. We've got to be accessing young men, in particular young boys, earlier, in terms of saying we need to be getting the right support in place much, much closer to the point of the abuse, or indeed to the disclosure, which we know quite often just falls on deaf ears, whether that's through a statutory provision or whether they've told someone in the family, or whatever the case may be. So we've got to be talking about it more, and we've got to be talking about it more in male circles, I think. I think that we've done a great job, and I think it's very, I think it's a different landscape for women to access services now. But we've got to work harder. We've got to work harder with younger men and boys in terms of allowing them safe spaces to talk about this stuff where they're not judged, and there's no kind of stigma attached to it.
Yeah. So just before I'm just conscious of the end's got to go in 4 minutes, whatever it is. So Fiona, if I'm just going to chuck you and drop you right in it. So I apologise. So if somebody's watching this video now, let's just say how it is. They've been abused. Doesn't matter where it was in their life. They're watching this, and then what should they do? You're the professional. What should they do?
So I just think they should reach out and get help. And that, if you're watching and you have anything to do with Suffolk, or you're in and around Suffolk, jump on our website, Survivors in Transition. There's loads of self-help resources. What we've tried to do is make sure that there's loads of stuff you can go and have a look at there before you get in touch. We recognize that making that first step, walking through the door, whether that is virtually or walking on site into our service in Ipswich, we recognize that that's just one of the hardest things you're ever going to do, because you're acknowledging what happened to you. And you're also recognizing that you need help. And, Dan, I don't know about you, Ian, I don't know about you, asking for help for whatever the purpose in our lives is just one of the hardest things for us to do. But I think let's just break that down and say, if something has happened to you, even if you're not sure and you don't think it was abuse, or, in your mind, you might minimize it a little bit and think it's something else, just get in touch and have a chat with us in the first place. You can do that by text, you can do that by email, you can do that face to face, over the phone, whichever medium you prefer and whatever makes it easier for you, just reach out. But I would also urge men who are thinking that they, or who have experienced some sort of sexual violence or abuse in their lives, to get in touch with a specialist, probably charity provision, wherever you are in the country. And if you're not sure where to start, super happy for you to get in touch with our team here at Survivors in Transition, who can certainly try and find a local provision for you. I'm not going to lie, there are long waiting lists, longer than we would like. In Suffolk, we've got a good provision at SIT. No one here will wait more than 3 months for a service, and while they're waiting, they will receive phone calls and kind of check-ins at a frequency determined by them. It's a postcode lottery. It's not the same everywhere else. There are some places where the waiting lists are just ridiculously long. But really importantly, just reach out and make that first step. And make a concerted effort to do that, because you deserve it. You deserve to get some support. You deserve to get some help. You deserve to recognize that it's not your shame, and the blame is not with you. So that's what I would urge men to do. Anyone who's listening and is struggling, don't struggle on your own. There's no need.
But I'll just say one thing I think is a yes or no answer, really. I don't want to speak for you. If somebody contacts you, I'm only saying by context of the conversations I've had, and I have referred to you before, as soon as they phone you, speak to you, whatever else, the police aren't going to be sitting there waiting to out them. And
No.
That's the one thing I have found, especially more so with men. They think as soon as they get help, the police are going to be there and there's going to be a court case. And that's just...
So I would say, that probably, apart from guilt and shame, the second biggest reason men don't contact us who've experienced sexual abuse and sexual violence is because they're terrified that they themselves are going to be labeled as a perpetrator or an offender because of what they've gone through. And I think that's a massive barrier for men to overcome. I'm going to assure you, I'll assure you on this call, there's absolutely no, unless, you know, reporting is a choice that you consciously make. As an adult over 18, there's absolutely no need for us to get in touch with the police, unless, you know, there are safeguarding issues that come out of that. And we will make that clear with you. We're never going to do anything to anyone that we don't tell them about. We're having an adult to adult engagement, and we're not going to go behind anyone's back. There's certainly no one waiting in the wings to hear about that. It's a totally confidential service, and we'll go absolutely at your own pace, and be driven by you in terms of, and also meet you where you're at. Different people at different paths on this journey in terms of getting support around sexual violence. And we want to meet you where you're at and kind of work with you and establish what's going to work best for you. So yeah, don't hang about. Don't let it eat up your adult life and your relationships and everything else, because it's toxic.
I'd like to say that's a good call. It's a call I didn't want to have, if I'm honest with you, but it is a good call. And do you know what? If one bloke reaches out to whoever, not necessarily, if it saves one family, it's worth it. The whole thing is worth it. But I'm quite conscious of this. So I'm going to hit the unrecord button thingy, but you bear me 1 second.